Hey everybody, as we go into Unit 6, looking at 1865 to 1898, 1900-ish, we're going to start to the west and move our way to the east, okay? So how do we close the idea of the western frontier? Remember back to last, you can talk about manifest destiny, right? The idea that the country is there for our taking. We're going to take that country. Guys, we're going to have it. Other reasons people move west go into trying to make it rich, trying to get freedom. All those kind of things might go into the ideas of why people are moving this direction, okay? So let's look at the idea. Now, what you'll notice we'll note here is a guy named Frederick Jackson Turner. He was actually a UW history professor who wrote something called the Frontier Thesis. And basically, he talked about this in 1893 that by 1893, the westward expansion had been finished, right? We basically found we have at least one person per square mile out in the west, and we have essentially settled all the wilderness. The wilderness does not exist anymore. We have to find our next manifest to destiny, okay? But he said the westward expansion also kind of set up and made the U.S. what it is in a way, okay? So number one is that it kind of showed the economic opportunity, farming, mining, fur trapping, whatever. We're going to do anything for money makes that happen. Our initiative, we take action, right? We don't kind of sit back and let things come to us. We go to them. That kind of deal. And lastly, our self-sufficiency. We learn how to survive on our own. A lot of times we talk about people learning how to work like Native Americans, work with Native Americans as a way to then learn more about themselves, be able to survive in situations that maybe they weren't 100% prepared for all the time, okay? And we'll look at his thesis in class and see if we think it's fact or bullcrap. Now, we do see the population center move west. We can kind of see this little map here. The center of U.S. population by this time in the 1870s, 80s is Ohio, and by the 1980s, it's St. Louis. So we're seeing the population slowly shift that direction. So we call this Great American Desert out here. The people got to try and settle into and cross. We were trying to cross initially going to California. Now we're going to settle it, okay? And so biggest problem is that not a lot of rain, a lot of grass, very deep grassland. This is a very deep-rooted grass that the roots might go 15, 16, 24 inches deep into the ground here. Hard to break up. You got 15 million bison living there. You got a 250,000 Native Americans living there. And by 1900, those are obviously gone, right? Native Americans have been moved somewhere else. Bison have been killed off. Ranches, farms, railroads, boom towns kind of replace everything in this settlement of the frontier. Notice here from 1775 to 1894, we see what happens to Native American land, right? And that how much Native American land is still held or where that land is actually owned by. And it changes a lot during this time. So a couple big laws we have to know here that encourage movement is the Homestead Act and Morrill Act. So the Homestead Act basically if you want to get a piece of land, you can get 160 acres free if you work for 5 years. Also give a bunch of land to railroads and land speculators. It's free land. Go settle out there, right? If you put a fence up, make some improvement to it, and live there 5 years, it is yours for free. It also created the Morrill Act, which made A&M universities, agricultural mechanical universities, new ideas of research, new ideas of farming techniques, basically made farming more of an education type situation to learn how to farm more efficiently and farm better versus just more. We also the Oklahoma land giveaway. By the 1890s, after we talk about the Dawes Act later on, any unclaimed land in Oklahoma went to people. And you have the Sooners who moved in before they're allowed to, Boomers who got there at the cannon. That's why you have Sooner Boomer for Oklahoma University. That's why they're called the Sooners. They got to basically take all the land they want to for free and for nothing. You have land grants. Land grants were given to all these railroad companies because they were told basically they could build all this area. They got not only the land for the railroad, but land on both sides of it. So they could build stations and towns popped up then and all that kind of stuff. And that was part of our transcontinental railroad situation that took 7 years to build, but was a huge connection as it brought the two sides together. Obviously, here's our homesteaders and the sod houses. There's not a lot of trees out here, so use a sod house. I've been in one of these sod houses before. They're kind of weird, very cool, very damp. Obviously, your walls are made out of sod, and you have creepy crawlies, that kind of stuff in there. But it was how you survive. Kind of like too, no wood on the frontier. How do you make a fire? You burn poo, right? Buffalo poo, cow poo. You burn that. Here we throw it in town. There they burned it as a way to kind of keep warm. Now, the homesteaders were kind of also influenced by speculators. These guys bought up a whole bunch of tracts of land for absolutely nothing and resold it at a big profit. Sometimes they lost their shirt. Sometimes they made millions. Kind of depends on the situation. But speculating is when you are taking that risk and trying to make a bunch of money off it. So here this guy is trying to sell people on the land he had purchased earlier and trying to sell them with smaller chunks of land. Now, those that weren't farming, we'll talk about farmers and ranchers, but mining was the first big thing. We had some gold rushes happen after the California gold rush. So one was Colorado by Pikes Peak. That was 1859. Yeah, New Nevada is the Comstock Lode, the biggest silver mine ever found ever. And so when this happened, basically people would flock there, try to find their riches, make a big old boom town. The boom town turns into a ghost town. Um, and so miners hired a lot of people from around the world, mostly from China actually, because they were experienced miners. There's also a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment. So we'll talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act later on, the miners' tax, anti-coolie clubs that existed, segregation that existed in California. In regards to how Chinese migrants were being treated. And the Chinese were actually the first group banned from immigration to the United States, okay, and it was 1882. So you can take examples from the mines. Here's the Comstock Lode. So you can build a mine down here. Super dangerous kind of situation. We're attritional mining here. So you're going down underground trying to find the veins of silver, gold, or whatever you're trying to find, other types of stuff. You can see the town that pops up around it, okay, which when the stuff is gone, then that's gone too, obviously. As we get later on here, you kind of see a more modern mining thing. This is high-pressure water mining. We're using basically high-pressure water to rip all the dirt and soil out and kind of destroys the area. So notice the environmental impact that comes out of this, too. As we build up these new areas, build these new towns, and then they just kind of go away at the end. Our cattle frontier, those who weren't farming, for trying to do the mining thing, we're farming cattle. We have all these Texas Longhorn cattle. They're pretty resilient cattle. They can live out in the plains for a long time and just live on grass. They can be by themselves. They don't need a lot of help and a lot of that kind of stuff. You brand them so you know whose cows are who. Let them go forage for the year, and you ship them off at the right time of year. This is where the cowboy tradition or vaquero tradition came from. A lot of it were Mexican cowboys, right? That kind of created the cowboy culture. Some were Native Americans, a lot of African American cowboys as well. And they had this huge, the idea of the cattle and the cattle drives and all that kind of stuff to get beef up to the east so you could feed the rest of the country as cities started getting bigger. A lot of cattle got killed off by blizzards overgrazing by the 1880s, and it was replaced by big fences and that kind of stuff. And barbed wire is kind of what ends up killing the cattle frontier because farmers will start fencing off land. Cows can't get through because they're going to start fighting about whose land it is. Is it land for grazing or is it land for farming? And so these got replaced by corporate ranches that were all fenced off. You didn't have these ideas of cattle drive anymore. Other things that kind of killed the cattle drive were going to be, so here's the cattle drives. You see, you go from these areas here and drive the cattle up to the railroad town so you can get the beef then over to the east part. Barbed wire is what changes it, because obviously fences are hard to build. You're trying to do split rail fences, but barbed wire, you just unroll it and take care of it. It keeps the animals out. And so that was able to kind of fence off the prairie and kind of end that open range kind of situation so you could fence off pieces of land. Gus Swift also changed a little bit too. He created something called the refrigerated railroad car. He used blocks of ice on railroad cars so you could ship processed meat already. So instead of driving cows, you were just butchering on site and then shipping one of these railroad cars to the place you wanted to go. Farming, then, last one here, we talk about the Homestead Act again. 500,000 families settle out west. Again, problems. No wood, no water, extreme weather, locusts, isolation, not great deals, okay? Barbed wire helped to fence off land, so you have your land, cows and animals don't get through it. Because we're dry farming, there's not a lot of water out here. You got to figure out how to get down to plant your crops. They started using different ideas like a deep plow, so the steel plows that John Deere created to help bust up that really, really thick grass. You started doing what's called dry farming, where you're using more irrigation techniques, also putting windmills out attached to water pumps so you can bring water up from underground and irrigate your crops. Honestly, a lot of farmers lost their shirts. We'll notice a couple of different groups in history kind of get hosed multiple times. Farmers are one of them, and 2/3 of these farms will fail by 1900. Because of price, what it might be. And that's just one of the cases of how things happen, unfortunately, through the history because of rising costs, lowering prices, all that kind of stuff where things go through. Now, railroads, obviously one of the biggest things to get people out there. Railroads expanded a lot. Okay, over 160 more thousand miles of rail were built from the end of the Civil War in 1900. It was able to connect the country, nationalize the markets, able to get more finance going on. This is our first big business, if you will. Cornelius Vanderbilt was the first guy. They called him the Commodore because he got into shipping, and then he switched to railroads. Started buying up all the railroads in the east, basically. The western railroads were based on those land grants. There's a lot of corruption, like Credit Mobilier scandal, where basically they got into land and they never built a railroad and kept the money. And so those things happen a lot with those places there. A lot of times we talk about the pools and fixed rating. Basically, the railroads were screwing farmers over left and right. They were making it almost impossible for farmers to make profit off stuff and kind of, holding the farmers at bay since farmers had to use railroads to get their crops to market. So the railroads had a lot of power. They were basing a lot of schemes to hurt them. They were and they eventually rolled in by the Interstate Commerce Act, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So these were our first big businesses with the stock market and corporations. They had a lot of government support with direct aid and tariffs to help them out. And railroads kind of became everything, right? Railroads led to the finance industry, the steel industry, the mining industry, agriculture industry. And so the government eventually goes from not at all regulating these things to regulate them through what we call the Interstate Commerce Act, with special rules that railroads had to follow when trying to transport goods to and from market. We saw the Railway Act to create that Transcontinental Railroad in 1862, so Lincoln kind of gets this thing going during the Civil War. The telegraph goes along with the railroad then, so as they build the railroads, a lot of times we see the telegraph lines go right next to them. And so the two kind of go together and connect through the idea of transmitting information, transmitting communication, and transmitting people and goods. We also have ex-dusters and Buffalo Soldiers. So these were African Americans who moved to the West, escaped slavery in the South, escaped discrimination and sharecropping. Some became homesteaders. Many fought in the Plains Indian Wars, and were a big part of that. So there are African American families that settle as farmers. You also had African Americans who fought in the military, so the Civil War vets on the plains as well. Women were a huge part of the West as well. It's kind of where you see some of the biggest ideas of equality happen since in the West, everyone had to kind of pull together. So women were kind of seen on a more equal footing. The first states that bring women in for voting are the Western states because they are important that way. And we'll talk more about that when we get into class, seeing, which ones kind of had the first women voting states. Well, the Western states, because things are a little more, equal that way. Immigrants, a lot of Irish immigrants came up with the railroads. They worked from the east to the west, so a lot of Irish settled that way because railroad was hard work. Chinese immigrants kind of settled from the west to the east as well. And we'll talk about some of the laws that go in there on that. A lot of nativism took place with Irish and Chinese people as well, so a lot of the hatred, kind of the nativism we saw earlier, continues in the western areas against those groups. Kind of the fear of foreigners taking everything over, all that kind of stuff. Which eventually goes again to the Chinese Exclusion Act we'll talk about later on, where the Chinese are not allowed to come into the country, and the first group that's basically banned from coming in. That's our first little video, guys. I'll have another one shortly about some farmer problems we got. Thank you for your time. I appreciate your attention. Thank you much.